issues around sustainability. And she's been a strategy consultant previous to that for various public, private and working groups. Just get my notes out, because there's two things that I would like to highlight. That she's a fellow and inaugural chair of the board of the Centre of Sustainability Leaders Fellowship, and she's also the deputy chair of the Terrestrial Ecosystems Research Network. And on your bio it said that hopefully you can survive the federal budget.
Yeah, we're still waiting to hear.
Okay.
We think we still exist.
Yeah, good. And so she's going to talk about why senior decision makers are not really taking decisive action on climate change. And John Weissman, I think everybody here knows, they've collaborated together on a recent paper, and they're going to go through that, and we'll have a discussion afterwards.
Okay, thank you. I'll say just a very few quick introductory words and then hand over to Lauren, who's going to really do the presentation. So yes, as Dimitri said, this is it's a work in progress presentation, but it is also connected to an article which is in the final stages of being drafted or completed for, which has been accepted for publication in Wire's Climate Change. But we would value comments and feedback both for the article and for the argument in general. A couple of very brief initial comments about where this comes from. It's been a couple of years in sort of development, I think, and it reflects a lot of conversations that we've had, and I imagine many of you have had as well, which I guess start from a scratching of heads of, we all know many senior decision makers in government and in business and elsewhere who will, off the record or over dinner or after a glass of red or something, say, look, yeah, of course I understand the climate science, and gee, I'm as concerned about this as you are, and yes, I can clearly, I've read the evidence as to what the technological solutions are, and of course I understand all of this. It's just that when I go into the boardroom or into cabinet, or when I actually have to make a serious call about where we shift money or what we do about a particular policy decision, I just can't quite bring myself to really act in a decisive way. And so that's the kind of conversation that I suspect many of us have been in. And so we were then interested in bringing together, reflecting on the evidence, which has built up over a long period of time, really, about that question, that is, why don't senior decision makers turn their understanding and their analysis into action? There's quite a body of literature about that over many years in relation to environmental issues in general. We were keen to do, as Lauren will explain, a bit of a review of that literature and bring it up to date, and then use it to sharpen our understanding of what that might mean for the climate discussion now. We, as you'll see, have used the quote from T.S. Eliot from The Hollow Men as a starting point for this, and indeed think that we'll probably call this piece Out of the Shadows to capture some of that, some of the issues that arise from the ideas behind that little excerpt from that poem. So I'm going to hand over to Lauren, who will talk to the paper, and then hopefully we can have a discussion about what arises from this. There's one last thing. This is actually, there are three authors on this, Lauren and I and Yoshi Kashima. Yoshi, who some of you will know, is a professor in behavioural sciences, an eminent social psychologist, and it has been one of those really enjoyable exercises in genuinely cross-disciplinary discussion. Yoshi brings a whole host of insights from social psychology that I think Lauren and I really valued, and so Yoshi is also a co-author on this.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Actually, the timing has worked out exquisitely with our revisions due back next week, so we've been pushing hard to bring this all together. As John said, this has been a really pleasant experience working with this. We've had a very nice nice research assistant called Gemma Wiseman. He's been very helpful, and it's been one of those research projects that is a joy to work on, except for the fact that it is possibly the most depressing thing I've ever had to do in my life. Except for that small fact that we've probably canvassed, I estimate, I mean it's hard to, but at least 60 reasons why senior decision makers in business and government are not acting on climate change. So if you're hoping that the answer is simple, I'm sorry, it's not. It's very complex. And it's far more complex than I think we had initially anticipated when we, rather ambitiously as we now realised, set out to just kind of bring all this together. Just bringing all this together seems to have taken us across the entire canon of social sciences and humanities. But so we'll cover off on some of the main points that we need to look at. But just to kind of, I'm talking a little bit to the converted here, but why do we need to study these SDMs, senior decision makers, and particularly those in business and government? Well, there are a few different arguments about how to tackle climate change, and they tend to range between two extremes. One is it's a collective problem, public action is required, we all need to do our bit and work on our behaviour, change our behaviour. Now that is undeniable, there's no question that that needs to be done. But when you start looking at the variety of the human population, not only within Australia but around the globe, you soon realise that that kind of universalist kind of hand-waving approach, that this is a general behaviour change problem that can be brought down to individuals, doesn't actually carry a whole lot of weight. Some individuals are, it has to be said, more influential than others when it comes to emissions. The other kind of broad approach tends to be a kind of faceless political economy. It's to do with big factors, to do with the treadmill of production that Marx first identified, and it's the capitalist machine and the military carbon complex. These sorts of analyses too have a very important grain, kernel of truth in them. There are large and powerful complexes at work. We are part of massive ongoing systems. However, having those kind of personless, faceless analyses also leaves you fairly unhelpfully lacking in any kind of real action. And so what we've tried to do is actually to combine the people aspect with the structure aspect and say, well, who actually exists in these complexes? Who is actually calling the shots, pulling the levers in these institutions and organisations? And so that's where we're getting at. You'll see there a graph which has just recently been published in Climatic Change, which also starts to kind of just bring home a little bit about the disproportionate effect different groups have. And Richard Heath here has identified 90, he calls them carbon majors, 90 companies. That's not many in the world, 90 companies. And you can see there the red line is theirs and the global line is the black one. You can see that 90 companies have contributed the vast proportion to global emissions. So it just gives you a very clear illustration of what we're talking about. And interestingly, not all of those are Annex 1 countries. They're obviously multinationals, but they're distributed around the world. The other thing is that there are reasons to think that there's been a systematic kind of occluding of senior decision makers. When we go out there and we do participatory research, collaboration, all these sorts of things, it's not often you're talking to the top tier. You're talking to the ones who are actually doing stuff on the ground. And that, and in all sorts of other ways, they actually resist being the topic of research. They're very, very difficult to access, and that is a problem. So what we've tried to do is to take a really open-minded approach to this and consider the various issues and perspectives, all within a very tight word limit. And so we've come up with a fairly simplistic kind of scalar organisation, but it's one which picks up on the very real tension between agents, so agency, individuals, and structures. And so we've looked at micro factors, meso factors, and macro factors. And we've also deliberately really taken an approach that looks at different power from different aspects. So not just the economic, but we also are interested in the political, which is to do with the social, the networks, and the cultural. We take a strong interest in discourses, ideas, norms, values, these sorts of things, which is my own sort of particular disciplinary background. Having said that, we have also tried to consider some variety within the groups, but overall we've had to kind of encapsulate this group we've invented, these sort of senior decision makers, and look at their commonalities. So let's kick off with the first level, the micro level, individual and interpersonal factors. So reading across the literature, as I said, we've been reading across the literature for a couple of years now. We've come up with 5 points here, and I'll take you through each one. So the first one is the one that often gets a lot of airplay in discussions around climate change action, and that is awareness and understanding climate change. And on the one hand, there is quite a large literature now that suggests that awareness and understanding, or at least belief in anthropogenic climate change, is not necessarily an absolute barrier to climate change action. But having said that, there are reasons to think that there is still an important role to play for actually kind of being aware and accepting of what's going on. And so when you look at how this affects senior decision makers, you identify a few different things. First of all, like all of us, there is a cognitive filtering going on. So we all have our biases and our shortcuts that we use to actually work out how we actually identify the evidence, and some of that filtering comes through in some of the other factors we talk about later, like political affiliation. Then there's the organisational factor. So we're talking about very, very busy people with a lot of staff and supporters. And so they are not out there glancing through the latest IPCC report. Okay? The summary for policymakers is not read by policymakers, or at least not by senior policymakers, certainly not read by politicians. Okay? They get the condensed 2-sentence version, or the 1-sentence kind of verbal version. So we have a kind of situation where you have a kind of human filtering going on, organisation filtering. Some of the research that exists around this suggests that in the business sector, the paid advisors, whether they're in-house or consultants, are very strategic in what they tell their bosses, because there's obviously a conflict of interest there. There's a commercial relationship, and so therefore you tell them what they actually want to hear. So there's an overplay of uncertainty. There is filtering around the actual implications and the likelihood of major radical climate shifts. Having said that, when they actually get the information, there's reason to believe that there's difficulty in understanding the complexity and system effects that arguably can be attributed to those who have quite specialised roles. And so you get that whole kind of specialisation actually mitigating against an ability to connect the dots. And we talk a little bit further about why there's a difficulty connecting the dots later on. The next thing is disciplinary background perspectives. Most senior decision makers continue to be educated and trained in the kind of trifecta of business, law, economics. And that leads to a number of particular problems. First of all, they're not doing science generally. There are some doing science, but they're not, which not only leads to those difficulties understanding it, but also raises expectations. So this whole notion that more science equals more certainty, that's a kind of fairly standard expectation. That when that doesn't happen, there's a kind of dismissal of the science. There are peer effects. The psychologists, Yoshi's area of expertise. Psychologists have done studies of business students, first year, starting their degrees, compared to psychology students, and they have higher than normal levels of narcissism and materialism. I don't say that to be deterministic. I'm not asking you to go down to the spot building and do your own participant observation, though that would actually be quite interesting. But nevertheless, it just goes to show that there is some kind of selective effect. So, you know that whole kind of like different people in different courses dress differently? Well, that's actually probably not completely imagined. There are differences in personalities that are attracted to doing different types of courses. Then, what are they actually trained in? Well, the dominant kind of canon is that of neoclassical economics, which has all sorts of issues when it comes to understanding something like climate change. It's reductionist, it's positivist, it discounts the future, it has an expectation about maintaining equilibrium. Even in law, particularly the studies that we're looking at here are from the US, there's an inclination towards a non-interventionist approach, so very high standards of harm have to be demonstrated before a legal agreement will be made to actually recognise victims in these sorts of cases. Law and accounting both struggle with this concept of carbon, so there's these carbon markets starting, but some of the studies that are going on as to how accountants and lawyers are doing that, well, first of all, they're not talking to each other. The lawyers design these structures, and the accountants are there to try to actually put them together, and none of them are actually sure kind of what carbon is. Is it a legal entity? Is it kind of like a tax? They're not quite sure what it is conceptually, and as I said, they exist in silos. So that's not good. But that's minor compared to the effect of political worldviews, values and affiliations. The strongest predictor of climate change scepticism is your political party affiliation. Studies in Australia show in particular politicians' views of climate change fall out very, very neatly on party political lines. I don't need to explain which party believes what, but you work that out. The other thing about political affiliations, particularly that this work again is based in the US, is that it's not just about kind of beliefs and policies. This is about who you engage with. This is about, well, who's giving you the information, who's doing your science. So the US conservative movement has its own science kind of enterprise, and it is designed to discredit what they call environmental impact science, including climate change. So it's working there to actually generate its own information, and it's about major flows of money. Studies show that political worldview actually aligns with a broader senses, broader worldview. So those from a conservative background tend to have a disproportionate optimism about life, about their agency, about the agency of the human species, about the value of rationality and the ability of technology to save us. Then when market responses actually start getting underway, some of the studies show that they're actually starting to develop their own momentum and logic. In fact, they're developing a kind of independence from climate change. So if these experimental policy mechanisms that have been put in place, such as the EU trading scheme, for example, if it's actually found that that's not keeping up with climate change, that actually it's not adequate, it sort of doesn't matter. It's going on now. It's going on. People are making profits from it. It's going on, and it's actually disconnected from where climate change is going. Gender. Well, yes, this had to get in there, didn't it? Who are these senior decision makers? Well, a lot of them, most of them, remain men. There's clear dominance still of that. But more interestingly than that, what's happening is that there are certain ideals. And what I mean by that is about personality and identity ideals, ways of acting, ways of being. Some of the research that looks at this looks at the role of this in risk perception. So how does this shape what risks you consider to be important and what you don't? There's this really interesting phenomenon called the white male status anxiety effect. All the white males in the room say. Which is simply to say that statistically speaking, this is not deterministic, that when you do broad population studies, there is a statistically significant difference in that the white males of the population tend to discount certain sorts of risks, including environmental risks, more than the rest of the population. So when you then put those people in charge of societal, economic, political institutions, you actually have a systematic difference in risk perception. Then there's the kind of status anxiety bit of it, which is that they are very, very concerned concerned about certain risks, and they're the risks to their reputation, to their status as real men, and this leads to all sorts of blame avoidance behaviour. So this kind of desire to actually avoid doing anything for which they might be criticised, they might lose their political office, etc., etc. And then the two to do with kind of emotion. On the one hand, emotion is very much considered a feminised thing. It's not part of the workplace, nor is personal values. But the other one is that the emotions that you do show better be positive, you know, confident, shoulder punching kind of optimism. And then this is my favourite one as a geographer. This is about lifestyle and location, which is to say that this group of people are people. They have lifestyles. This is not just about what's going on in the office. And those lifestyles, both personal and professional, happen to be particularly high carbon ones. So there's a personal investment there. It's not just about the decisions they're making for other people. They're also environmentally insulated lifestyles in that there's a work talking about this transnational elite, people who work and live in international major cities around the world that tend to be homogenous. They spend a lot of time in airport lounges, the private ones that we can't get into, which means that they're much more disconnected from the weather and the conditions going on in any particular places, which means that cognitively they're less sensitised to that. So there's a lot of work about how the public can become sensitised to the climate and weather in their place. Well, this generally says that the place is a homogenous one, and then when they do go home or work in the CBD, etc., they tend to be nice places. They're not there on the edge. They're not there watching the tsunamis, etc. Not that I'm saying tsunamis are associated with climate change, that wasn't a bad example. Okay, organisational, institutional factors. So again, there's 5 things we'll go through here. The first of which is social identities, norms and networks. So this is, again, building on the kind of picture that I've been building so far. This is a group of people that are very similar, and part of that is because they focus very intently on each other and go to great lengths to actually copy each other. Okay, so there's a kind of, they call it homophilia. It's about this convergence, strong convergence effect in what we believe, what we do. We dress the same, we like the same sports, we do the same things, we go to the same clubs, we have the same attitudes, and that spills over into attitudes towards climate change. There's also a small world effect in that there's actually some very tangible ways that these networks, particularly the elite of the elite, there's a very interesting paper around the French corporate elite, which the author talks about having hyper-agency, that they control the systems that actually therefore put them in place at positions of power. Okay, so they control the schools, they control the clubs, etc., etc. And then there's this performance aspect, which is this strategic use of multiple identities. So who you talk to in one context, whether it's a dinner party, might be different to the next day when they're in the boardroom. Okay, so what management paradigms are people working within when they go into these workplaces? Well, the first one is that it tends to be very pragmatic and utilitarian, which is about consequences. So if we do this, what's going to happen to us? Okay, what are the costs and benefits to us? And so that's the kind of a starting point. Then there's also other kind of broader ideas around, so neoliberalism being the idea of minimum government, free market, ecological modernisation, the concept that the environment can be enhanced through development, that they're not enemies, that there's a kind of win-win situation. Formal risk management, so this is about quantification, it's about breaking things down, putting them in boxes, giving them numbers, and giving a sense of control over this. Very obvious new term focus, which in our paper we quote Ian Dunlop, who's one of the interviewees in John's Post-Carbon Pathways project, talking about his time at Shell and observations in the business world about just how short-term this is. This is day-to-day operation. You know, I'm just concerned what's happening right now. And then the perversities around HR incentives, how people get paid, what they're actually aiming for, etc.
I just throw in a comment. I think just a conversation I had yesterday, which was actually part of the discussion with Jeff Sachs, but talking to a couple of people from senior consulting firms, senior levels in corporate consulting firms. And it's a question I'm often really interested in asking, which is the time frame, over which people are calculating risk and opportunity, and and again, of course, the time frame is calculated in either months if you're talking about performance bonuses, or certainly a couple of years. I think this disconnect between the time frames over which we think about risk and the effectiveness of our actions is really quite fundamental.
Which reminds me of another factor, which I haven't got on the slides, but which is about the churn, particularly in corporate world, but also we could perhaps apply that to our government at the moment, which is that people try to make these long-term decisions, like long-term investments, but they're not the CEO next year. The leadership changes so much that the sense of corporate memory is lost, the sense of continuity. Okay, so what else is going on? Organisational culture, so that's kind of like the feel of the place. What sort of organisation are we? It's that organisational identity, team, chest beating type stuff. A lot of this is very strategic. It's very a lot of effort goes into corporate reports and strategic storytelling, and this isn't just in the corporate world, this is in government departments as well. Who are we? What do we do? What do we stand for? No, we don't stand for that. Nope, outside the box. So there's a kind of bounding that goes on. Managerialism is a kind of broad cultural idea, which is that the private sector ideals around efficiency, competition, bottom line are universally applicable. So they need to be applied throughout all government departments. It doesn't matter if it's social welfare, climate, energy. That's the kind of that's the mantra. And then a particular kind of issue in the corporate world is this focus on shareholder value. The idea that the whole raison d'etre of a corporation is to provide value to their shareholders, and everything else is secondary to that. So it's basically a profit motive. Organisational leadership and capacity. Well, one of the issues here is, as much as we have said this group is very powerful and influential and deserves close analysis, individually they are each relatively hijacked, in a sense that we're talking about very complex systems, and it is actually difficult as individuals to be a very effective agent for change. There's no easy steering mechanism. There's also research looking at the way that people in these positions of power, while they may not be able to necessarily push forward major change agendas, can actually very effectively hijack other people's change agendas really quite easily. They look at the way strategic planning processes get put off the rails, just stuff like, thanks for the report, I'll deal with that, never, that sort of a thing, just the kind of this strategic responsiveness to what's going on. One of the things the literature really helpfully points out is that for major organisational change to occur, organisations, people need to be resource ready, which means this is business management. It's been quite hilarious reading the business management literature. But so they need to be resource ready, so they have to have all their ducks lined up. They've got to have the money, they've got to have the capacity, they've got to have the goodwill, But it doesn't talk about how to get there. Okay, so to me that's kind of like, a fairly subsequent step along the way. So there's this kind of positive feedback that goes on. And then they also talk a lot about the need for vision. Well, we've seen already about why that vision about major transformational change and an organisation, an institution response to climate change is unlikely to be there. Institutional complexity inertia adds to this sense of having difficulty in making change. One of them is the very obvious point that existing institutions have a lot invested in them. This isn't just money. We have a significant not just money, but we're talking about people's values, their identity, their political, they've kind of put their, what's the saying? They've kind of, decided to really invest in a particular idea, so they actually therefore feel they can't back away from it. So words like desalination come to mind here in the Victorian context. We've agreed to do this, we find it's not a good idea, but we've made too much of a show and dance of doing this. Then there's the fact that actually some of the climate change responses that are coming are actually adding to this complexity. So there's new mechanisms here, there's new mechanisms there. You look at the array of just even the market-based mechanisms of which we're are quite critical, even they seem to be relatively disconnected. They measured carbon this way, you do it this way, the UNFCCC, the IPCC, there's all these kind of different things going on, which is actually kind of making it difficult. But you see the bottom point there is that some of the players here are actually exploiting this uncertainty. They're kind of playing it, they're playing the game. Another thing they're playing is the fact that there's weak governance, so there's voluntarism. So they talked to the studies that indicate that some US companies have been very, very supportive of the existing climate responses in terms of market mechanisms because they think they're really crap. They're like, terrific, let's embed this. So they actually strategically do that. And the other one is around competing institutional logics, which is to say kind of broad rationales. This isn't just to do with, in the global accounting framework, they talk about competing logics, one's around commerce and one's around accountability. And it means that you can kind of slip between them when your critics come and say you're doing the wrong thing. But the same thing applies in broader work, and so the institutional logics around how you elect leaders tends to flip between a meritocracy, it's a talent-based thing, let's just judge people on their merits, and then there's the kind of hereditary birthright type thing, which is, well, this person, they've got what it takes. They've got the right name, and there's analysis looking at the continuity of surnames in leadership positions, and it's very continuous. Okay, so moving on to that third category, which is about the broad context, environmental, socio-political, economic type things. And we look at 4 different things here. The first of them is this idea of climatic extremes. In that sort of talk around civic engagement with climate change, public behaviour change, there's a lot of hope in the fact that as climatic extremes become more frequent and more intense, that people will have some kind of enlightenment moment and will come to realise that this is what's happening, this is what the future is going to hold, we had better act. Now, I sound cynical, but there is good research to suggest that can happen, though how long that continues for and what precisely the reactions are is more questionable. But what happens with senior decision makers, as I've already said, is that they tend to be somewhat insulated. Not only that, but they're actually embedded in a situation, like all of us, but perhaps particularly so, where risk and crisis is kind of normal. It's like, radical change, shifts, major disasters, that's like my daily bread and butter. So to talk about kind of like a major transformational shift or a tipping point in the climate may have less effect for those for whom market volatility is a kind of daily iPhone kind of mentality. Then there's the difficulty actually attributing extremes to climate change, which we see demonstrated by the top political scholars, leaders in Australia. The idea that you actually get to choose how you represent a crisis. So if a crisis happens, and I'm talking here organisational crisis, institutional crisis as much as a climatic extreme, that is a story that you tell. So do you admit there is a crisis? If you admit a crisis, what's the causal effect? Is it a contingent, bad luck? What do you actually draw out and emphasise here? And then let's say that you do acknowledge that there's a crisis going on. Well, if you acknowledge a crisis going on, well, that's actually therefore what the literature calls a window of opportunity. Now, most climate change researchers really cross their fingers, all the resilience type scientists saying, yes, excellent window of opportunity for transformational change, panarchy is going to occur, this is a wonderful thing. And certainly there is a sense in which, there is a true opportunity, but there are also real risks here. One is that it's deliberately used to actually push through further negative changes. One is that it's used to short-circuit proper processes, consideration. You can get some kind of heroism points by coming in. I mean, just think of Anna Bly's Operation Bounce Back following the floods. You know, you put the Yakuba on, you call it Operation Bounce Back, and say, we are Queenslanders, it's going to be okay. You know, so that was a kind of real political moment for her, and it really increased her support at the time. But whether it actually led to planning changes and an acknowledgement that climate change is a real problem for Queensland, I don't think so. So yes, you can see that there are some risks there. Okay, perhaps one of the most commonly mentioned, particularly in the Post-Carbon Pathways report, problem is this one of vested interests. Okay, there are big, powerful groups involved who do not want action on climate change. They do not want any action. They particularly don't want substantial action. Anything involving degrowth is just anathema to this sort of group. And so we have a few things that are happening. First of all, they have really geared up to become extremely well organised. I talked earlier about the kind of reactionary science movement and enterprise, which has occurred. There's the whole blogosphere, all the think tanks, etc. So information is being really used as a weapon. It's not like climate science is going out into a vacuum. It's going out there to combat with misinformation. There is a very strong kind of discussion around this being inevitable, and the kind of sense of the omnipotence of the economy and capitalism, that this idea that there's no alternatives, and shutting down any alternatives as viable ones. Game theory gives us insight into some of the kind of mentalities that are involved here, and the well-known issue of prisoner's dilemma is sort of often talked about. So this idea of how do you actually get collective action when there's a risk of losing out relative to others who may play you. So how do you actually sort of avoid being played in this situation? Economic drivers, political culture. Here, the kind of overarching problem here is simply that this itself is dominant. Okay, this is the dominant distraction, this is the dominant concern. Then when you look more precisely at what's going on, you look at the existing economic policies, taxation structures, these sorts of things, you can see that they're actually very much invested in a particular growth model, of which major climate change action would require major changes. And so you've actually got a kind of major contradiction that needs to be addressed there. Then you've got, in the more near term, this volatility and the distracting factor of this, the markets, what they're doing, and this was particularly apparent with the GFC when they found that climate change belief, even, not even climate change concern, but belief actually dropped off. So you can see there people's kind of susceptibility to this. And the alternatives, the green policies that are coming through, so around renewable energies, for example, still remain fragmented. If they're not fragmented and they're coming through, there's a concern that they're not permanent. And so you get that uncertainty which scares off investors. And the last one, public. That's us, in a sense, and the climate imaginaries. So first of all, there's a tendency to underestimate public concern about climate change. And you could say that that might be a sort of self-serving bias, but you could also relate that to the fact that there isn't a whole lot of song and dance being made about it, that there is room for a far greater public voice on this, and that there's a kind of a vacuum there for which people to make their own strategic interpretations of what the public believes.
And Lauren, just to throw one point in there, I think that's where the role of the media comes into this as well. So the research that CSIRO, amongst others, have done about the way in which people's understanding of public opinion is in fact mediated by the way that's reported. So if you ask the Australian population, what do you think about climate change, you will get a particular figure of 45, 50%, whatever it is, in support of taking significant action. But if you ask people, what do you think the rest of the population thinks, people say have a much lower view of what the support from the general population is. So there's a disconnect between what people actually think and what they think the rest of the population believes, which suggests to some extent that that's mediated through various sorts of media presentations.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly in my empirical work with farmers, that's been very much the case. You know, so when a farmer I was interviewing would say to me that they were concerned about about climate change, they would usually preface it with, well, you wouldn't actually believe it, but I'm actually a bit concerned about climate change. But so many of them said that, but it was all sort of secret. Yeah. So, and then the final point is about what some researchers call climate imaginaries, which is how we imagine in the future. What are the broad discourses and narratives about the future that are being perpetuated? And the dominant one is that we'll be right. Technology will save us. Wish they would just hurry up and get it organised, but through technological and market means, we will come in with this heroic save at the end of the day. Another one is that they call here fossil fuels forever. So the idea that somehow we will maintain our current way of life and that no change is required. And the two alternatives that these particular researchers, Levi and Egan, look at are called apocalypse, which is highly resisted by the techno-optimists. They find it not only like ridiculous, but just confronting. It's like threatening, this idea that the future is apocalyptic. And the alternative lifestyle ones just doesn't really kind of gel with people. It's just like, no thanks. So you can see that there's this kind of broad stories out there which are shaping how people think and respond to the climate change message. So what can we conclude about all this, except the fact that it's actually really, really bad? Well, I mean, the first and obvious point is that in all sorts of ways, intentionally and unintentionally, we could argue, and a lot of this is speculative, but we could argue that senior decision makers are very actively protecting and maintaining their existing system, the existing system. And there's all sorts of justifications for that, and there's a broad range of views as to what that goes from. And we've got on the one hand the kind of, image of the evil oil company baron, and on the other hand the kind of caught and anxious public servant, top bureaucrat, trying to do the best thing, but nevertheless finding themselves always compromising because of the dominant situation that they're in. So it's sort of across that spectrum you have this system protection tendency. We also can see through some of the work, and perhaps I haven't done it justice in the presentation here, but please do read the paper when it comes out, that this is a group of people that are distinguished by the fact that they do have much greater capacity to shape the systems that they're part of, that we're part of, as well as to respond to it. So I think there is a really strong justification for focusing upon them when you see the way that some of this system protection is actually about system creation. There is a real potential for influence at a collective level, so acting in cohort, even if the individual agency of any particular decision making is quite constrained. One of the interesting things is that while we're talking about people who are operating at that international level, okay, they're multinational corporations, they're big national kind of departments, it's all about global issues, a lot of what seems to be constraining them is actually the stuff in the office. It's actually the stuff of their peers, it's actually the stuff just in their organisations. That kind of near-term stuff. Well, in a temporal sense, it's the immediate pressures, so what's going on today, next week, what's the next report due, da-da-da. But it's also this kind of personal side of it. It kind of comes down to that personal side, the role of norms and logistics and expectations, which are kind of being played out. Another kind of aspect of this is the way that these systems can actually be traced and decomposed into a whole lot of repetitious patterns of behaviour. Okay, so even when you're talking about the fossil fuel lobby and its power, we can start to trace, well, that's because this group pays this group, and they run a conference with this group, and then they scratch their back and they scratch their back, and you can actually decompose it down to that kind of practice behavioural level. And that is where perhaps potential for hope can exist. Because if you actually start to break down some of these routines, so it might be the way you go about accounting for climate risk in your business, and you have a system, you perhaps paid a consultant to come in and give you a very expensive system, it's all integrated, it's all in the intranet, you've all got different ways of doing things, and you've got your distributed tasks between the group. Now, if you actually start to have awareness that that's actually limiting your ability to see the big picture, to actually take into account catastrophic risks, etc., then there is potential that you could actually start to question it. And so, as much as senior decision makers have a non-linear effect on the system, okay, they're a relatively small group, they're an elite, they're a minority, and they have a disproportionate effect on where the globe's going. Just think back to that first graph about disproportionate effects. Then perhaps we can use that to advantage. This is the idea that you can somehow get them to do even seemingly minor things and try to get some kind of triggering effect through the systems. One of the more general points here that really came up in some of the reading around this is that it's sort of a literature thing, that there's a kind of whole lot of literature around the distribution of risk that's coming out, particularly in discussion around World Risk Society, or Beck, good German philosopher, talking about how risk is now normalised and part of our everyday existence. And then this kind of much older, quite environmentally unaware sociological literature around distribution of class and power. And we need to start putting these things together and say, okay, well, how are they actually overlapping? You've probably heard of the double exposure effect. This is Karen O'Brien and Robin Lachenko's thesis that the poor in society are doubly hit by climate change, in that they are contextually vulnerable, they're vulnerable before the fact, and they're particularly exposed and sensitive to climate change impacts. Well, is there perhaps some kind of inverse going on with this particular group? And is there therefore some kind of efficient way of dealing with both problems at once? There you go, efficiency has a positive connotation. Overall, what we're talking about is dealing with lots of different issues at once, so therefore it's obvious that we need some kind of multifaceted response. Our project looked at the reasons that factors that were constraining decision makers, but I do want to indicate that there is literature looking at causes of positive change. 3 things that stand out from that. One is this idea of institutional entrepreneurs, who are characterised, they have a number of personal characteristics, but one of them is that they're very comfortable being marginal. They're comfortable not being at the centre of things, and in fact they're often in this kind of knowledge brokering role where they connect with different people. Now, I'm going to say institutional entrepreneurs are not always out there for the public good. Okay, they might be entrepreneuring for their own good. But nevertheless, I think just that it kind of reinforces the kind of stultifying effect of some of these norms and desire to be liked, this homophily amongst this stereotyped senior decision maker group we've talked about. Then there's ideas coming particularly out of resilience literature around shadow networks. This is the idea of people working kind of behind the scenes, getting things ready, preparing ideas, coming up with alternatives, doing the visioning, working things out, so that when a window of opportunity does open, or in fact is created, that an appropriate response is ready. And I think that's something that would probably resonate with a lot of you with the sort of work that you're doing. And the third is looking to the civic society, but not as a group of individuals or green consumers who are out there to buy the right low carbon option, but actually as a collective, the idea that we actually also need to work as a collective, just as senior decision makers do. And all of that raises, I think, interesting questions for us in academia to stop and think, okay, what are we contributing to here? It feels like we're increasingly marginalised, but maybe we can become entrepreneurial about that, use that, and just think about what kind of climate imaginaries we are contributing to with our work, both deliberately and unintentionally, and what sort of power relations are we embedded in, and how is that perhaps altering what we do. Okay, I'll leave it there.
I just wanted to add one last comment, and it is again reflecting on the conversation I was in yesterday with Jeff Sachs and a group of both senior business people from DFAT, people from senior academic backgrounds as well. And one of the questions he was asked, he was literally coming from drawing insights from his role as key advisor to Ban Ki-moon and in the preparation for COP 2021. And one question which was asked of him in several ways by both senior business and government people was what faith he places in, if you like, the inside track and the outside track at the moment. What's the level of faith, confidence you would have in serious achievement of climate of emissions reductions outcomes by relying, if you like, on all of the ways in which you influence the senior decision makers, the inside track, as opposed to the shadow networks and the outside. And I mean, I thought it was, in a sense, his summary, very briefly, kind of, I think his argument boiled down to, look, there are, of course, all sorts of ways in which the inside track is important. There are all sorts of ways in which that discussion, and all sorts of ways in which we need to think creatively about challenging these range of variables and challenges. But they, in the end, the inside track is also finally going to be driven by the outside track. In other words, it's an argument about the importance of both understanding the importance of leadership, but also the understanding the importance of citizen mobilisation as well. And so, to me, this comes back to questions of strategy and transitional change. What's the balance of forces that can really bring about fundamental transformational change, given some of the challenging drivers that work against that as well. But thank you. So can we questions, thoughts?
I thought that was really great, Lauren. Well done. Thank you. And it's actually really comforting because this is all the stuff that I've been coming up with for my research on the challenges of governing climate engineering. It occurred to me, which is sort of the stuff I've been looking at as well, is that I love the way you've got the micro and the sort of macro, which is kind of the approach that I was taking. And if you had, you put things next to each other, actually a lot of those points are essentially the same things, and just, it's the domino effect, because it's happening here, it's happening here, and a lot of them are connected in different ways. So you don't need to address, you can't address each of those challenges, but it's more sort of a case of, well, if this were to change for whatever reason, then that would have an effect on this across here, or if this institution won't, mutate, then that would feed across. And I wonder what would be the sort of optimal solution. You really just need to address these two kind of barriers, and that would have an effect across all three. Does that make sense?
So are there any kind of trigger points?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I think one question, and I'd be interested in everyone's thoughts on this, although I'd be interested in Don's thoughts as well, in particular. Many people would say, yes, well, at the end of the day, the trigger points are about leadership. Finally, somebody at reasonably high up has to they have to be championed. There's a theory of organisational change around the importance of champions, and indeed, my own experience, certainly in government, is that at the end of the day, if you don't have a prime minister or a premier or a head of a prime minister's department driving something, then it probably won't happen. So, I think it raises some really important questions about if you've got a vicious circle where there are all sorts of reinforcing factors that are stopping something from happening. You know, where do you intervene? Is the greatest effect from the top, or are there other places to intervene? I mean, Don, can I just to perhaps to introduce Don Henry, who some of you may have not yet met. Don's former CEO of the Australian Conservation Foundation and was in that role for the last 14 years, I think, and is now a Vice-Chancellor's Fellow at this university based with MSSI. And Don's probably had some experience of dealing with senior decision makers in these kinds of roles, so I wondered if you'd like to throw in.
Thanks for throwing an easy question.
Yeah, that's right. So why is it change?
Yeah, because it's the simple equation equals MC. And forgive me because I missed the front of the presentation. I was held up, and Robin, wonderful to see you here, and I'm very lucky to have a former chief scientist here in the room. Look, I won't give you an easy or simple answer, but I actually, Lauren, I was just catching the end of that. And I think there is an important answer here, and that is basically it is important to do analytical work. And this doesn't necessarily have to be academic, but you do need to sit down and analyse the societal and the decision-making processes. And you've got to know what your science is saying and where you need to head to, and then you do have to carefully deconstruct how is the decision making happening. And some of that can be broad. You have cultural dimensions up there. Some can be senior decision makers. And I've used with ACF, we use a number of tools sometimes to help in that process, plus get assistance from very fine people. Companies use a similar range of tools, and there's a very simple thing where you can do a power mapping exercise and basically map, okay, who's making what decisions on what, that's key here, and then you use informal knowledge and formal knowledge to work out, well, are there some key influence points? And John's exactly right. I mean, observation is change is a very messy process, and sometimes it can come down to a particular senior business leader or a prime minister who had a personal experience that means they've got an insight or an awareness on these issues. I mean, I've heard many people say that Prime Minister Thatcher, and it may well be Mrs. Merkel as well, she's got a science background, I think, hasn't she? Yeah, and many people argue with Thatcher, who was quite informed on climate change, fairly early voice there. It was her chemistry background, I think. So there can be an individual experience of someone who happens to be in one of those senior decision-making roles, but you have to do that analytical work to work that out. And there'll often be, what we've found in the work we've done, if you just take a little slice of the climate debate, so say renewable energy laws in Australia and that shifting space, change is pretty messy, it's pretty complex. There'll be cultural things going on, there'll be senior decision makers, there'll be good science information, there'll be corporate behaviour and change and interest, investment community change and interest. But there is a bottom line here. With some rigour, you can tease that out and you can do best guesstimates of where key change points are across a culture or organisation or a government and the like. So I haven't answered you to say this is it, but you can, based on good information, do a deconstruct, and there's still judgment points in it. And the very best way to do this is a historian and look back on what's happened 10 years ago, so you're not in the middle of the mess, and it all looks a lot clearer then. But in the middle of change, just really having some rigour in working out where the change points are, and testing as you go. And what you're doing with that will be different. If you're an Australian Conservation Foundation versus a corporation versus a government, we'll be doing different things with that analysis. So I haven't answered you properly, but there's lots of tools that can build on some of the inquiry that Lauren's going through, and then good expertise in culture.
Robin, you wanted to add any observations?
Let me make a couple of points. First, and this is just anecdotal from half a lifetime in corporate places and government places, as Don's alluded to. Everything you ran through there fits in with my anecdotal and personal observation from moving in these places. These are the sorts of people. And I would add one, I think you mentioned it actually, but I would reinforce it. It is actually a very tight group of people. You go into the chairman's lounge, and sorry to admit you, I do have a pass for the chairman's lounge, and you will see the same front bench ministers, the same CEOs and so forth, and you know them. They greet you and ask you, what your kids or grandkids, in my case, and what have you are up to, and all this sort of stuff. It is a tight group. You go to a football match, which I don't do, and I can assure you that the CEOs of very large multinational competing companies are in the same box, having a beer or red wine or whatever together. Tight group. So you're absolutely spot on, I think, in your descriptors, and it applies with government as well. Senior ministers and CEOs of large companies, one and the same ilk. You've covered that, I think. This is splendid work because it spells out quite rigorously what the real world is like. Now a comment on this inside track, outside track, and who do you target with your effort other than going away and just being depressed, which is, at the end of the day, might turn you on or off, as the case may be, but it's not particularly helpful. Now the intriguing thing there is in terms of the inside group, its short-termism that you've covered several aspects of is actually driven by the outside group. And this is a link that I think is not, one, fully understood, two, used in this sort of debate. For example, some of you here, when you're earning, out there in a job earning money, other than doing slave labour called research and getting a pittance for it and so on, we'll all be paying taxes, and you'll also be contributing to your pension. Now, I know that sounds unimaginable at the moment, and believe me, it's a long way off for most of you, but you will be. Now, what are the pension funds that you'll be forced? UniSuper is one of the best pension funds, by the way. I can assure you of that, because I compare them.
UniSuper virtually crashed in 2009.
And it is one of the best ones.
Really? Well, I would argue that's
So, I stand by my statement. I can assure you, I look where my dollars go very, very carefully. And what do these pension funds do? They require these large corporations to turn a short-term profit, or they simply take their money out, and they are the biggest investors in companies, and put it in other companies. So bingo, I'm not trying to excuse the behaviour of the group that you've described, but what chance do they have when the investment, which is us ultimately, because we're outside, we're the little people, and the sigma of all of ours makes these, even in Australia, $1 trillion funds. Would you believe one of the idiocies of giving people the choice of fund, whether you go to UniSuper or CSU or whatever, is that it's forcing the funds to invest out of Australia. Because as soon as you say to the funds, the people who are going to put money in can, anytime they want to, take their money out and put it in another fund. The funds have to keep a certain liquidity so that they've got cash on the table to give you, because it's your money, whereas what they should be doing is investing in long-term things like dramatic changes and so forth, and our free choice to be able to pull money out stops them doing that. So they're investing offshore. But that's another story. What my point is that outside, which is us, drives the economics of big firms and politics. The politics, of course it's a next election. Of course it is, for heaven's sake. What do you expect otherwise? If you're mad enough to live in a country that has 3-year terms instead of having a benign dictator. But don't take that one too seriously. But that's, why not? At least have 5-year terms so governments can be held responsible and at least see some of the effort of their actions, then you've got some chance. So my second point, and I've spent too much time on it, is as outsiders, how do we get a different message across to the insiders that actually we don't care if our superannuation fund doesn't show such good returns for 5 years. We don't want it to go bankrupt, of course. But actually we'd be quite happy for it to do some longer term stuff. And the Cooperative Research Centre that I'm chairing at the moment, we've actually got the superannuation fund signed up as one of the participants. World first, thank you very much. To get them interested in research and investing in it as part of the longer term in the future. Now the third point, which I'll be very brief on, is an easy one. Okay, you're spot on. I mean, it's great analysis. So what do we do about it? And you've come up with some of the ideas of what we can do about it. One that I like, and you can say, well, this typecasts me, is to say, what can you do within the inside system that in effect talks their language but gets your climate effect? And this is not a start of an excuse to say, oh, let's all go nuclear or what have you. Far from it. What I'm thinking of is some of the firms that we're familiar with in Germany in particular that are essentially don't have the 3-monthly or even faster reporting requirements and are prepared to innovate and do things in the marketplace which then make them money in the long run and end up, because these particular class of firms that I'm referring to are very environmentally conscious. They've had a couple of generations of people that own them and go through them that have grown up in a system which takes environment reasonably seriously. Mind you, I don't like them planting bloody solar panels in hop fields, because where do you get good hops from? This is near Munich. I sort of object to that, but that's by the by. Beer is better than photovoltaics. So how do you concentrate on finding, and Dom, this is something ACF I think has been quite good at, you were referring to finding the pathways where you can get change. And I would add a bit to that to say, and you can get change that's going to be seen by the current inside mob as playing their game and doing it better.
Okay, thank you. More questions, comments? I think there's a couple earlier on tonight.
Well, yeah, I just wanted to comment that the picture that you painted was scarily similar to what I've experienced in the 10 years that I've been with Joe. It's exactly like that, and it's very, very scary.
Yeah, spot on.
And And so I think from the inside it's extremely difficult to create any change because you've got different values compared to the senior managers. And I think a good example is how companies treat safety. There is a notion that from a lower level safety is seen as not important enough. There's still people dying on workplaces. And so companies like that have seen, well, from the highest level, from the top, we need to top down introduce this safety culture. So it's really the top driving the whole company. It's not like you can initiate change from the bottom. So if the senior level decision makers are not doing what they're supposed to be doing, then I think you have to look outside to I like the link with the...
Well, what I'm suggesting is find people who can make change, and they'll be middle order companies. They won't be the huge ones, by and large. Doesn't mean you don't try, but find the middle order ones, and by example, they will drag the others.
Yeah.
Other comments, questions?
Yeah, I was wondering, we were talking about the unawareness of the political leaders. I was wondering if in some cases they might not be aware of the consequences of climate change, but can think that it's better in a long-term perspective for the country they're leading to not spend money and power to deal with mitigation, to keep a competitive position, and in the end, this particular country would be better off in a degraded world, but this population of this country would be better off. So in the end, these leaders would be accomplishing a long-term development of the country and doing what they're supposed to do, taking account that they only have to care about these people. And in the end, usually what we're asking to our country is to preserve the interest of its people and not so much development, 1% or something of the GDP. And I wonder if in some countries, although our messages act logically, what we're not asking for in the end is a development to live in a better world, but not just for ourselves, so the citizens of a country.
No, I think that's a really important and concerning question. I mean, and just thinking anecdotally, I mean, I can think of some comments by reasonably senior people I can think of, more in America than Australia actually, but which go something like, which had a very sharp and kind of fairly accurate assessment of climatic risks, but draw the conclusion that the best thing to do therefore is to circle the wagons, is to make sure that relatively well-developed countries which are for the time being capable of adapting and maintaining resilience, they should make sure that they have the resources to do that. And by the way, if you can make sure that you've earned enough to make sure that your grandkids can buy a house in southern New Zealand or Tasmania, or in other words, it's a strategy of saying yes, I'm fully aware of what's coming down the track, but I think the best thing for us to do is to protect a particular population, a particular jurisdiction. And I think that's a version of this argument which is quite concerning.
So on that, do you think the politicians are usually more unaware of the consequences of climate change, or that they're aware but they could have more of this thinking?
I know what Lauren and other people have had these conversations too. I mean, I think my sense is, there are several, as with the general population, there's clearly a group of people who do pay attention to the science. And within that, I think there are groups who are really committed to doing something transformative, and there are other groups who take a more cynical position. And then I think there are groups who are, for various reasons, either inattentive or, to some extent, just don't want to know. So I think it's hard to generalise actually that level of knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a really pertinent ethics debate, which you see particularly in the developing world context, between near-term pressures and a sort of protective mindset and longer-term diffuse global good around mitigation. So, there is, I think, a real need to take seriously the dangers of saying, and I'm talking here about disadvantaged groups, of saying you really ought to be investing in mitigation rather than self-protection, and it sort of plays out with that mitigation adaptation.
So where do you put China in that block? Is China rapidly heading to be about 1/3 of the world's emissions, rapidly heading to that position, with a dreadful state of the environment in the major cities? Anyone can go any time on the web and look up the particulates less than 2.5 micron, and you can just dial in a city and see right now, hour by hour, what the PM 2.5 is. And you won't find the high scores, just pick any of the large Chinese cities, Beijing in particular. So sort of ask it as a question, in that you've got, it's not sort of an elephant coming into the room, it's already in the room. You've got people who are taking, and the Chinese government has at least in the current 5-year plan put a whole load of targets on, and given the way their plans run, they've got some chance of them being attained. Not to get emissions down, but to get emissions per head down, which is sort of second prize, but it's better than no movement.
I mean, China's one elephant here, India, I guess, is another. And two quick stories there. One is, I don't know if you've ever heard Sunita Narain, when she was out here recently, who's been the head of one of the major Indian environmental NGOs for many, many years, and she was asked, well, given climate change, what did you think about coal exports to India? from an environmental point of view. And she said, look, I'm going to be brutally honest. I think India needs to, will for the foreseeable future have a significant coal-based, coal-fired power system. So I support Australia continuing to export significant coal to India. And some people were quite kind of upset by that and said, well, how is that consistent with a position around climate change? And she then launched into a fairly fierce argument about levels of responsibility historically for who has caused the problem. It hasn't been by and large Indians any more than it has been the Chinese. So you get quickly into this discussion about historical responsibility as well.
But that's a really tricky one, because if you take the India example, and even worse, Pakistan coming up, which has got the odd low-lying area, by the way. Pakistan at the moment has found, only 20 years ago, the world's largest low-rank coal, and it's really crappy stuff, with sulphur and mercury and what have you. World's largest low-rank coal deposit, and they're getting loans from the Asian Development Bank and others to develop it. And I look at that lot and say, now, here's a moral dilemma for you. What would Pakistan and India, it applies as well. India's coal, by and large, is terrible stuff. The fact that it's black is surprising because there's so much ash in it, you'd expect it to be white. But that's just sort of the nature of Indian coal, and a lot of Indonesian. Well, Indonesia's got some good stuff. Is the world better off if Australia exports high-quality coal without the mercury and sulphur, and with a high calorific value, and without the ash, to India and Pakistan, or leave them mine their own stuff, which they inevitably will? I'm not saying it's good that they do, but there's the sort of, you talk about your inside group at the moment, you want to give them something to get their teeth into, pop that one on the table.
Dimitri, how long do you want us to keep going, or do we need to finish up soonish?
Well, I think we do, because I looked at the clock half ago and it's still on the same time as it was. That's not working. It's
I like that.
after 12:30 already. But I deliberately did not stop the discussion because I thought it was valuable.
Yeah.
So we can
maybe
break up.
one or two more questions and then we should finish up.
On the topic of China, I was talking to, after Ross Kano's lecture yesterday, I was talking to a lady called Christine Wong, I think, from a new Chinese policy research centre that's just opened here. And I asked her, given the kind of the efforts that China's making on renewables, and their emissions trading scheme, what the motivation was behind that. And she said climate change was actually very, very low on the Chinese agenda. It doesn't really feature in the debate at all. Primary motivation is A, reducing local emissions, particulate emissions, and B, the opportunity that there is to become, the world's largest solar panel manufacturer, the world's largest lithium-ion battery manufacturer. So I think, the economics in the market does have a very important role to play in the adoption of renewable technology.